Oh, I've taken away your introduction. I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Anita said, I shall be going over the fourth and fifth points for this 5-star work plan which we're recommending to you today. And the fourth point regards what to do with all the new animals that we bring in, so quarantine for newly introduced animals. And as I mentioned before, it's important. Can you hear me well at the back? So as I mentioned before, whenever we talk about new introductions, this isn't just sheep. It's also for any new goats and camelids that you are bringing in, because as we've mentioned already many times today, they share parasites. So it's important that you treat them in the same way to avoid importing any resistance. So any new animal that you bring in, you should treat it straight away. And with what you treat it depends on where you're bringing the animal from. So if you're bringing the animal from a farm where you don't know whether they do have anthelmintic resistance or not, what we recommend is that you treat first with ivermectin and then with fenbendazole. You should use both drugs at their full dose and not mixed together, but rather consecutively. So first give a full dose of ivermectin, followed by a full dose of fenbendazole. This is if you do not know anything about the farm of origin. If, on the other hand, you're bringing in an animal from a farm that knows that it has anthelmintic resistance, you should consult with your veterinarian with what drugs you can use, because the veterinarian might suggest using an alternative drug to make sure that you are cleaning that animal from the parasites. Once again, remember that if you are bringing in new goats, you need to treat them with the correct dosages to make sure that you are getting rid of any parasites present. After you've treated the animal, it's important to keep them in quarantine, which means keeping them away from the rest of the flock, and keep them in quarantine for at least 48 hours. And we recommend doing this so that you make sure that any parasites that are present within the animal, any eggs that they are shedding, are not going to contaminate the rest of the flock. So you want to keep them separated. And any manure that these animals produce during these 48 hours that they are in quarantine, make sure that it is properly disposed. We usually recommend composting it to make sure that any eggs that have been produced during this period are destroyed. So do not use manure produced from these animals in quarantine to put on pasture. Make sure that it is properly disposed of. Lastly, once the 48 hours of quarantine is over, turn these animals onto a contaminated pasture. And this comes back to the ideas that we've been discussing throughout the day. We want to make sure that the animals, if they are carrying any resistant parasites that we have not managed to eliminate by treating them, we want to make sure that we're going to put them on a pasture that contains other parasites which may dilute these resistant ones. So turn them onto contaminated and not clean pasture. We also recommend that you take fecal samples from these newly introduced animals so you can know whether they are carrying any parasites or not. And when to take the fecal samples depends on the season, which time of the year it is. So if you've brought in these new animals during the grazing season, so during the summer months, and you've treated the animal, take fecal samples 14 days after treatment. We've mentioned this very often, many times today, that we always recommend taking fecal samples 14 days after treatment to see if the treatment worked or not. However, if you've brought the animal in during the winter months, we've mentioned today that these parasites tend to go into arrested development. And so you might take fecal samples in the winter and the fecal egg counts will come back negative. This does not necessarily mean that the treatment worked. It might just mean that the animals have gone into arrested development and so you do not find any positive counts. So if you did bring in any new animals during the winter months and you've treated them, make sure to take fecal samples the following spring. So before you turn that animal back out onto the pasture, take fecal samples then, because that is when any arrested parasites that might have survived over the winter would come back into action and start producing eggs. So you will catch it then before putting it back out on pasture. And that is actually the end of this short presentation. If you have any questions, yes?
When we brought in a ram last year, he had never been out on pasture before he came onto our property. And we did a fecal egg count as soon as we brought him in. Does it still make sense to treat him?
Well, if you've taken the... Okay, so the question was, this lady here mentioned that they brought in a ram which had never been on pasture before on the farm where they brought it in, and they took a fecal egg count. They took the fecal egg count when they brought him in. She asked me if does it still make sense to treat the animal then, and I was going to ask you, the fecal egg count, was it negative?
Yeah.
Then no, don't need to treat. If it's showing it's negative. Are there any other questions?
Does the dosage only work during active times of the parasite?
Pardon
Or
me?
will it work at all during the dormant period?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
The treatment that you're giving your animals, your livestock, does it work at all during the dormant periods that the parasite is in?
So rephrasing the question just to make sure I understood it correctly. So when we deworm the animals, does it work if these parasites are in arrested development or not?
Yes, does have any.
As Jocelyn mentioned, so different drugs have different efficacies against arrested parasites or not. Ivermectin and benzimidazole should be effective against arrested parasites. As she mentioned, it might not remove them all, but the majority should be removed. Levamisole, there's a bit of a dispute whether it does work or not. Some studies show that it does, others that it doesn't. But most anthelmintics are effective against arrested parasites too. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes?
With winter-born lambs, they're about to be weaned and go out to pasture. They don't have immunity because they were just born. They're lambs. There's no point, this is a question, there's no point in deworming them prior to pasture.
No, usually we recommend that ideally you should monitor the lambs. So after you've put them out on pasture, and if they were born in the winter, you know that they are eating grass. So usually 2 weeks after they've been out on pasture, ideally you would take fecal samples first to see if they actually do need to be dewormed or not. And then if you have positive fecal egg counts, then you would deworm them then. But yeah, it doesn't make sense deworming them before because they wouldn't have been exposed yet. Yes?
When you treat with one, then the other antibiotic, how long in between?
Oh, you can do it straight away. Oh, excuse me. The question here was when you treat with the two different anthelmintics, how much time must you allow before the two separate treatments? And you can do them consecutively, just treat with one and then with the other. It's just important that you don't mix the two drugs together in the same drench gun. You just treat first with ivermectin and then with fenbendazole, and both at their full doses. And the idea is that treating with ivermectin, you're going to remove any ones that are resistant to fenbendazole, and any ones that are resistant to fenbendazole should be removed by ivermectin. You're hitting them both. That's the idea. Yes?
He was using multiple products. You're going to have an extended withdrawal time for these? Withdrawal time in lambs, there's something between lambs that you have to watch the withdrawal time for meat too.
I'll refer this question is Jocelyn around. So the question is, if we're using two drugs at the same time, is there an extended withdrawal time? And I'm not sure about the answer. I don't want to say something that's incorrect.
We didn't ask G. Carrot, but that's a really good point. We should probably be prudent to give an extended withdrawal.
Did you hear that? Did you hear it? Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, I didn't discuss comes in.
Oh, you're gonna do these at the end?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
The last point.
Came here.
Waiting for questions.
Yeah.
So the very last point on this 5-star worm plan is investigating treatment failure. So what do you do if you've been deworming and it doesn't seem to be working? So the first thing you need to keep in mind is the problem really parasites? Are the animals sick because of gastrointestinal nematodes, or are the clinical signs due to something else? And it's been mentioned numerous times already today, but other causes might be responsible for the clinical signs you're observing on your animals. So keep in mind that, for example, if your animals are not putting on weight or have a poor body condition score, it could also be nutritional. So you might want to look into their nutrition. If you're seeing diarrhea and dirty dags, coccidia might also be a problem. So you might want to look into that. And if you find animals that are dead on pasture, sudden death, Dr. Menzies mentioned it before, pulpy kidney might be a cause. So keep in mind that there are other diseases out there and they might be causing symptoms, clinical signs which are the same. So what you could do is take fecal samples and do the fecal echoes to see if parasites really are the problem on your farm. And if you find any dead animal on the pasture, you might want to take it in for a necropsy. And if you find worms, then you know that parasites really are the problem, or if there's something else. If parasites really are the problem, then the second question you should be asking is resistance on my farm. And as we've mentioned before, the first thing you can do to determine if you do have resistance is do a drench check. So treat the animals and then take fecal samples from some of them 14 days after treatment. And if you do have positive fecal counts after treatment, that might mean that resistance is on your farm. So at that point, it would maybe discuss doing the fecal egg count reduction test to confirm whether resistance really is present on your farm. And if it is present, then once again, discuss with your veterinarians what your options are. And these should include both which anthelmintics you should be using, how to use them, and as we've mentioned very often this afternoon, all the different management practices that you can use in a sustainable, integrated way. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions. So I'll go to my questions for you. So my first question is, new animals that are being brought in should be kept in quarantine for 12 hours, 48 hours, or 2 weeks? People have So the correct answer is 48 hours. So we need to keep them in quarantine for 48 hours, after which we can put them on pasture. 2 weeks is the time that we leave for between treatment and taking fecal samples to check if the treatment worked. But 48 hours is sufficient for the quarantine. So the second question is, manure from animals in quarantine should be spread onto the pasture, left accessible to the rest of the sheep flock, or properly composted? Excellent, everybody got it right. So manure from animals in quarantine should be properly composted to make sure that the rest of the flock doesn't have access to the eggs shed by the new animals. And the last question. If treated animals don't seem to respond to the deworming, you should keep treating the animals with different anthelmintics, increase the dose of the anthelmintic, or do a drench check or fecal egg count reduction test.
Yeah.
Jason's college.
Excellent, everyone got it right. If you think the dewormers aren't working, check it out and consult with your veterinarian. Thank you.